Hey guys, so what you're about to watch is about an hour-long conversation with Sthalekar of Sacred Capital. And we're talking about the economics of neighborhoods, we're talking about memetic bridges between communities, we're talking about more than the monetary economy, basically currency designs that take us out of the monetary economy or at least complement it. And so if any of those topics sound good to you, stick around. I think you'll enjoy it. And let me know in the comments how you thought. All right, see you in the next one. Ciao, ciao. All right. Welcome, Sid, to this conversation on my YouTube channel.
Thank you. Yeah, pleasure to
um,
be here.
great. Yeah, we were just talking before hitting record about sort of where we're both at personally this year. Certainly has been lots of things happening. I think not only because of Corona, but also simply because of the development in the spaces we both share membership of, the holochain space, currency design, those kind of things. Um, yeah, why don't you give me and my audience a rough understanding of what it is that you care about in the world, and then how what you're currently doing is serving that care.
Sure. It might be a little bit of a long,
That's
winding
cool.
answer.
That's
Yeah, yeah.
great. Yeah,
Because I think
we're here for the deep stuff.
because I think it intersects. It's very interwoven with my personal journey, and I think what I do is sometimes an expression of that.
Yes.
Um, and I think you could say it's like related. Like I come at most things because of my background in finance. I look at things with the lens of money and more importantly with the lens of wealth. And because I would say of my South Asian background, my Indian background, I constantly am seeking diversity. And that's like the interplay that I'm most excited by. Um, so for context, I was an 80s and early 90s kid in born and brought up in Mumbai, which is like a city of 25 million people. And I don't know how many are familiar, but back in the 80s and early 90s, India hadn't liberalized. And so we had this weird Soviet socialist economy where there was heavy restrictions at the monetary material level. We pretty much had just two brands of cars and one television channel that everyone watched. Which was very interesting because it seems really restrictive, but at the same time, India was also very communal. And so at the cultural level, you just had insane, like I would say it's radical diversity. So I grew up speaking 4 or 5 languages, and I didn't even think of it. Like I feel like now we glamorize the speaking of languages, but that's not a thing in India. You often find people switching between cultures, foods, um, in a very, very, very organic manner. And that's because my parents came from different parts of the country.
That's
And so I
very
was
interesting.
just,
Sorry, I'll briefly
yeah, go ahead.
interrupt because I was just talking in my last video with
Mm-hmm.
Tiago Forte, who
Mm,
is the founder of Building a Second Brain and Forte Labs and all of these like uh, mm, online courses around how you can organize your knowledge, like it's like knowledge management, basically personal knowledge
mm,
management. And he was saying something very similar to what you're saying here because he said he's from Brazil and he has
mm,
shared Brazilian and Japanese ancestry.
mm,
And so, having grown up partially in Brazil and then also his father like exhibiting these things, he was telling me that he finds himself coming back more and more to his like background and to Brazil as an inspiration for how to think
mm,
about knowledge management because those people there, they live so fluidly, whereas in the
mm,
West we have always these very strong
mm.
categories and objects and those kind
Yeah,
of things. And
yeah.
so interesting that Brazil and India have that shared feature.
I would say so, yeah. And I think it's been a feature of India because it's almost like there's a joke like every 50 or 100 kilometers you'll find a new language, a new cuisine, a new art form. Like it's constantly flipping. And I'm very intrigued about how, like, there's another statistic. One of the central like forms of literature of Indian religion, of Hinduism, is, again, I'm not trying to bring religion into this, but I'm very intrigued by the design of it. The Ramayana has 200,000 versions of it. So it's almost like there is, a certain set of central values, but each community had the freedom to fork it as per their context. And so it was an interesting way to organize society when you don't have like an overarching central seat of power like the church probably had. And so I think that, flows into the way most things are organized in these societies. But in any case, I think I grew up, in this diversity of culture, and especially in Mumbai, like, in a city of 25 million, you'll constantly see different stories. Like, Mumbai currently has the world's most expensive house and some of the largest slums in the world, and they coexist. And for me, like, that was just part of, what life is. And I remember this period in the mid 90s when India, like Mumbai, like as an 11-year-old, I witnessed riots, communal riots in the city. And it's almost like India flipped the switch where they said, this communal life or this life of tribes isn't getting us anywhere because we're constantly warring it with each other. And so, neoliberalism kind of presented itself as, join this global party. And I almost as a kid, feel like we collectively made a trade-off, and where it was, if we're willing to mute our cultural identities just a bit, and start, getting into this monoculture of watching Friends and chasing the Nike shoes, um, there was, something really worth building here. And I would say I am probably the 10 or 15% of India that benefited from this wave of neoliberalism that swept the country. So from a very young age, like, went to business school and joined the capital markets in India. And there was this romanticism associated because I think it was solving some pretty serious infrastructural problems. Um, and I was also jazzed by the idea of capital markets solving most problems. Um, but very soon I could kind of see how it was almost this homogenizing force pushing down on a very diverse society. And I think when you have that, it starts creating some of the cracks. And maybe that's a conversation for some other time, but I think some of the rising authoritarianism and revert to identity could be linked to that tension that we saw for those 20 or 30 years. But anyway, my journey was always in finance, and I feel very fortunate to have like been there at that time because it was pretty much the wild, wild west. We were like the first people to write algorithms for trading in India. We were the first, equity derivatives really took off. Um, and I got to see the 2008 crisis, with almost like a front row seat. Um, but around 2010 and 11, I was left with a lot of questions because I could see these conflicts that were building. I didn't have too many answers, and that's also when I came across um, some of the works of Gandhi, especially his writings around economics. And so I actually took about 4 years to step off the grid, and moved into a community that was founded by Gandhi during the independence movement, which he used almost as a laboratory for social movements back during the independence struggle. And during those 4 years, I think they were quite transformative because they helped me experiment with my fiat footprint. Like, I think, the way people experiment with the carbon footprint, could experiment with my fiat footprint. Um, but I really got into what's known as Gandhian economics, which is economic coordination without the help of an overarching um, regulatory system
Mm,
or consensus mechanism.
mm,
Um, and there's a bunch of literature on it. But it's also at that point around 2014 and 15, I came across some of the people in Metacurrency through my community, had a very interesting chat with Eric Harris Brown. And I think it um, opened up a few windows for me where I could see, projects like Holochain were really about broadening the definition of wealth. And so for me, the last couple of years have been about building sacred capital, but the larger vision is how can we create a wealth system that actually promotes diversity in a very meaningful way.
Diversity of wealth,
And
maybe as well.
diversity of wealth, but I think it's more, I would say it's a formal economic language for culture. And that's because
Wow.
the the I think the monetary system that we have now is one formal economic language, but it imposes a certain homogeneity on us. And I think that homogeneity is also some of the reasons we see this polarization. We see some of the rifts that social media, etc., causes. But instead, what I'm trying to say is, can we create an economic protocol where groups of people can organize themselves and create their economic systems? And my belief is, when we're speaking about distributed systems, the emphasis shifts to reputation. It's almost like monetary currencies become derivatives or functions of reputation, because Sid can issue all the cryptocurrency tokens he would like, but at the end of the day, who is Sid? And what if he takes this bag of coins and disappears? Where is that fabric that holds us all together? And I think some of this, for me, is very intuitive. Like growing up in South Asia, like a majority of commerce today, I would say 60 to 70%, is still organized through these means of social coordination. For example, I can show up in a city in India, and because of trust networks in place, I will have access to capital because there's people vouching for me. And I think I'm not glorifying those systems. I think they're deeply flawed because they're prone to paternalism, tribalism. But I think distributed ledgers allow us to change that around. And so I think reputation currencies play a very important role here, and Holochain allows us to step into that in a more meaningful way. Yeah.
Fascinating. Yeah, 2014, 2015 was also the time that I first got wind of this whole thing. So we share that time origin.
Yeah.
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 It seems like a lot of people were strongly impacted by the 2008 financial crisis, and then sort of spun down some personal road of discovery, looking for like ways to make sure that this never happens again, or at least doesn't impact the people when it does happen as strongly. So I don't know.
Yeah, for me, I feel like that was one of the nails in the coffin. I think there's a few progressive people who were seeing the signs way before, but as a 27, 28-year-old who witnessed it, and I remember like Lehman Brothers was one of my biggest clients, and to just show up in office one day and these icons, right? Like in business school, you just
Yes.
I grew up admiring them, and just overnight it's gone. And the fact that there was no blowback, the fact that there was no skin in the game really hurt.
Yes. And the reputation suddenly evaporated.
Yeah, yeah,
and then it reformed very quickly.
yeah. But I think more about like sitting in Mumbai, like I could see some of the cracks. Like while it was all nice and shiny in the late 90s and early 2000s, I could also see, I think working in Mumbai really grounded me, because while you might be making money enough to buy yourself a Porsche, at every traffic light there's actually a kid who's doesn't have food to eat, and that's very real, like as gross and in your face as that sounds. So I do feel like there was an advantage to being in Mumbai, because you could see, like, you literally step out of your office and you're facing realities. And I kind of felt like this trade-off that we made of muting our identities was going to catch up to us sometime. And I think neoliberalism served as this nice universal template. But eventually we would have to start figuring out how to organize ourselves. And I think that's, I think that's kind of how I look at things and the way I approach things today.
It's very, very interesting. I see a couple of parallels between multiple points in this conversation so far already, where there's this sense, like sort of like how our body breathes in and breathes out, or have sort of growth developments. Just like how my personal growth development last year, for example, like was incredible rush of excitement, lots of energy, etc., and then a collapse in a way. There's the same thing in economic systems, where the system that you articulate has certain affordances and constraints, and then it
mm,
also has only the ability to support the system up to a certain point, like up to a certain
mm,
point of scale. And if there is no affordance for the unknown in it, and
mm,
a mechanism by which to adapt it as time moves forward, you end up with
mm,
these boom and bust cycles that
mm.
that then have more or
It's
less
true.
terrible
True.
consequences.
True. And I can say, sitting here in Asia, and again, disclaimer here, I don't want to reduce extremely complex problems that we see in the world to very simplistic solutions, but it's just my lens on, where I'm sitting and the way I
Right.
look at things. But um, this sense of tribalism, especially in Asia, you see a lot of return back to, your people's original cultural identities, whether they're Hindu or Muslim or Chinese, and I almost feel like that's part of that process of breathing out, like, as people disconnect from this, flavorless template. And now, as people retract back, because we don't actually have the tools to articulate what we're doing, it's almost coming as a knee-jerk reaction, right? And it shows itself as either supremacy or authoritarianism, or just cultural wars on the internet. And I'm very motivated to build, like I said, that formal language for culture that allows us to organize ourselves without burning our neighbors down. And I think that is the true risk here. Like, community, we've been through enough of these these conversations where the concept of community is romanticized. um, and I think, as an Indian, it's not pretty. It's like, people will burn each other alive, and unless we develop those formal systems, I don't think it's, very real. Or, like you said, it's probably going to lead down towards a bust. And which is why, um, I'm kind of reminded of our initial conversations when we connected on these topics. Was, I think it's important for us to start building bridges, or create those economic systems, or, as I call it, memetic bridges between tribes. And I think that is super critical when we're talking about reputation-based currencies and community-based currencies.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. That's it's interesting. Like, I have been involved in various intellectual communities and conversations over the years, and in one of them, I've been exposed to this idea that humans are inherently uh, motivated uh, by defending the things that keep them alive. I mean, that's basically a truism. It's a truism also
Yeah.
about any organism, right?
Yeah.
Like, any
Yeah.
organism will try to defend whatever source of food or sustenance it has. And so the curious thing about humans, though, is that for us, not only is like the land what sustains us, but it's also
Mm,
our relationships, it's our tools, it's our ideas, it's our concepts, it's our norms, it's all of these things that are so seemingly intangible, but then so very real still. And
mm,
so what I hear when you're saying we have to find a way to build memetic bridges is to
mm,
not only find a way to bridge between communities that may have different norms,
mm,
concepts, etc., that allow them to navigate the world effectively, coordinate, and so
mm,
on. And those may be different from community to community because,
mm,
of course, every community faces different geographic and whatever other
mm, mm,
affordances and constraints. Uh, but then as you move between them, or as they build relationships, those
mm,
conceptual universes, those cosmologies even, they don't necessarily
mm,
always fit. And I guess India is a hotbed of experimentation in that sense, where there are so many very different
mm,
perspectives and ways of doing things. And of course, they do
mm,
clash. And I guess, though, it still works somehow.
mm.
So I guess India definitely is well positioned as a place we can look, at least, to find
Yeah.
some real world um, demonstrated ways that these bridges can be built. But how do you feel about it? What are these memetic bridges for you?
Well, I think I'll probably start with a more personal example, more
Yeah,
like an anecdotal
yeah,
evidence, and then move towards what we're building. But
yeah,
I kind of recall my childhood. Both my parents came from different parts of India, and we lived in a city that wasn't native to either of them. And so I grew up speaking the local language, each one of their languages. And what's interesting is, amidst this mesh of cultures, my most familiar language, or the language I'm most familiar with, is English. And that's just because these cultures didn't really have the ability to translate things. So my mom and dad didn't have a common language, and so English became this overarching default, right? And I think that's all often the case, because when tribes don't know what to do with each other, you tend to default to
you,
Facebook or Google
right.
to coordinate our activities.
Yes, yes, yes.
And so I kind of
You look
see,
for the existing bridges that are there, and they can be whatever. Like English, I guess, is that shared
yeah,
thing because everybody learns it in school,
yeah,
right?
yeah. Or like what's even more funny, like grew up speaking it at home because my mom and dad spoke it to each other, and that's just odd and weird in a way. Um, and so I also have these moments where my mom's side of family, my dad's side of family, like culturally very different. And from very early age, you kind of figure out what the context is and how you engage with the context, how you switch between cultural identities, and not in a weird way, like, I'm suppressing this side of me, but almost in an empathetic way. And I actually feel like I don't think I thought of this as a thing until my wife, who is monolingual, comes from rural New Zealand down in the South Island, where it was pretty monocultural. I guess that's a word. And so speaking with her, I kind of see how, yeah, I'm constantly switching between these identities. And I think that is the key to memetic bridges, like finding those areas of commonality, and being able to build wholesome channels. My sense is neoliberalism helped us with this to some extent in the past, but the bridges we built were really crude. You could say monochrome in a way, like, or binary in a way, like, and the primary bridge was trade, and which is why someone like me grew up just learning about how trade is good for the world and global trade is good for the world. And it leads us to interesting situations like today, where nobody actually has masks of their own. Like, China produces the whole world's masks, and then we kind of wake up to the fact that there's something askew there. But also it's a very crude bridge, and so the only thing I knew about Thai culture was Thai curry, right? Like, and that's because that's what trade threw up to me. Or it's very gamey, like, kitschy almost, if that's the word, way of looking at cultures. Or like, it's almost funny how people interpret Indian food just through like some of these very stereotypical items. And so I think building or using reputation currencies, or using reputation as a wealth system, allows us to build multi-dimensional memetic bridges. And so there's a difference between, I would say, me showing up in Hawaii and going to the most popular resort there and living there and then flying back after 5 days, as opposed to being hosted by friends who've been there, being hosted in the culture, engaging with the culture, and coming back.
Right,
Like
right,
this, the dimensionality to that bridge is, I would say, it's the difference between monochrome TV and, I don't know, HD TV.
right,
Like, that's the difference. And
right,
so what I'm proposing here is a wealth system that actually has that potential, right? And for me, what's really exciting is building economic infrastructure for this more expressive society, that we can actually broadcast these multidimensional cultural identities, as opposed to you just thinking of Sid as the guy who sells samosas around the corner, right? Like, that's what I'm talking about. And so what's really critical here, like, I think when we talk about reputation currencies, there's some super critical elements. One, I think it needs to be done in agent centricity, and I think with agent centricity, and I think Holochain is a key role for that. But two, one of the challenges with reputation was it was always locked up within a silo. So, in most Twitter conversations, you'll see people bashing reputation systems, and and I think it's because the experience of reputation has been, Airbnb ratings or Uber ratings, and I think there's issues with it. Number one, there's no agency, so you have no agency as a driver over your rating. I think Holochain addresses that because it flips that equation on its head. But two, it sucks that my Uber rating is limited to that silo, and we have to figure out ways in which people can actually port it. Because if we are to develop anything as a wealth system, I think it gains meaning when we receive sufficiency through it, right? Like if I give you $100 bill, you don't question where you can spend it, but you would have 500 years ago. And so with reputation, I think there's two ways you can build sufficiency with it. One, grow your ecosystem to a size where it starts having meaning. Like today, an Uber rating has a meaning because there's millions of people who recognize it, and I think that has issues with it because then again you're moving towards scale. So the local cooperative network of rideshare drivers in your down the street have no meaning because their reputation, they can't guarantee safety and hygiene. Or I think number two, you could actually open up these memetic bridges. And so let's say I'm a driver in my local network here in Singapore, Lincoln Road, and I wish to port into where you are in Portugal. For memetic bridges to actually allow for my reputation to port there is really critical because now we can guarantee certain behaviors irrespective of scale, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why Uber, to me, has the monopoly that it does because it can modulate behavior because of scale. And I don't think just building agent-centric technologies and agent-centric apps is going to flip that because people will still be concerned about safety, about who a good driver is, and which is why you need memetic bridges in coordination with these technologies.
Right.
Yeah, and so that's some of the infrastructure that I'm very excited about building.
Mm. What I hear from that is that the issue is not so much with reputation currencies or even that they're so these relatively one-dimensional rating star systems, but that the determiner of that system existing and continuing to exist and evolving or not evolving is one company organized around the interests of a very small set of people, and their interest lies in, of course, appreciation of their stock price, or the returns they get out of it, right? So what I hear from you speaking about the problems with that is more that, well, what the vision for you is that when you build memetic bridges, first those memetic bridges have to be between communities also where probably the communities themselves have had some say and continue to have some say in how they take their values and cast them into some kind of record keeping form that allows them to coordinate even better. And so you could have a rating in your small group that could be like an Uber rating, but you could also have something else where it's like more like I like this guy, and like that's like it's a binary, right? Like do you do or do you not? The rating is like it's like a rating system. It's like a on a scale basically with discrete steps. And that's some of the parts for me that are the most interesting about what you've done, because you've actually opened and made available to people on, I think it was the GitLab or GitHub.io or whatever it may be, this wiki
Gitbook,
thing. Yeah, Gitbook, exactly.
Gitbook.
Like an explanation and a resource base for people to see how many different ways that you can use like numbers, words, binaries, like whatever the measure is, right?
I call it specific articulation.
Specific articulation.
I think there's a dynamic here, and I think it's very interesting, again, looking at it from a lens of wealth. Why does Uber not move away from a very monolithic reputation? and I think you summed it up right? Like to deliver value to its shareholders. And so I like to think of, again, drawing this polarity here, like the centralized economy has apps and businesses, like that was the organizing principle. But I think when you start applying the apps and businesses model into distributed world, things really break down, because number one, apps and businesses are built around the principles of competitiveness, and I think that really is a ridiculous idea when you're talking about, small micro networks. But more importantly, apps or businesses are about specific technology and generic culture. So when you go to a Facebook, you go to Facebook because there's this way in which the wall scrolls, the way your feed arrives, like it's very specific. But there is this generic culture that's imposed on you. You can't have a say in which you interact with people, because Zuckerberg needs to deliver value to his shareholders. So he needs to extract maximum monetary value out of you, and therefore the culture is designed in this way. And so it's, I would call, a very generic monoculture. It's the culture of money, you could say, like what gets us the maximum money. Whereas in the distributed world, I think you have to shift your lens from apps and businesses to what we call neighborhoods. And so neighborhoods become the organizing principle, where it's about generic technology, but more specific culture. And so
Beautiful.
I like to, and this is what Holochain is really enabling, right? Like I can fork a chat clone, a Twitter clone, a Reddit clone, and use these as very generic tools for my community. But what distinguishes my community from yours is the way I have specifically articulated culture, and that's a neighborhood. Because in my neighborhood, maybe the reputation curve is exponentially distributed. Like maybe just the top 5% have visibility, and maybe I like to use upwards and downwards instead of claps or likes. And so Holochain allows us to offer people these little reputation building blocks. So someone like you can actually come in and like stitch together a little collective of yours. Let's say upvotes aren't really working. You want to go with, claps. You can actually swap one DNA out for another. And so you actually get to iterate and play with your culture. But if you try to do this with an app, it's nightmarish, right? Because you've built this massive monolithic stack, and to actually swap cultures is impossible. And so, which is why I think Holochain allows us to play with, and like I said, specifically articulate culture in a way that is central to communities, which I think an Uber or a Facebook will almost never do. So I like that. Like I like the idea of neighborhoods and driving that philosophy going forward as an organizing principle.
Right. What comes to mind is that the way these businesses also start off or start up and then scale up is that they first go into a specific market generally, and then they use it as a sort of laboratory, sort of very similar to how the scientific method works, and then build from that very specific experimentation general abstract principles of how their software should operate, that then they put into another place. And then now there's in two places you have the same thing operating, and then every time there's some kind of dissonance, or like something happens that actually takes away from the stable infrastructure they've created to extract that value, they try to either deflect it, like fight with lawsuits, or like try to do more support or whatever it may be, or change the software a little bit, but then that change is reflected everywhere rather than just there. And so you have the system that is basically building itself up by trying to, as you said, like harmonize across all of these different places, rather than not.
Contextualize.
Yeah, exactly. Contextualize. And so what I hear you saying is that instead of having these imperial scaling ambitions on the one system level, you instead confine the scope of what you're trying to do as a community, or as a startup, quote unquote, which in this case wouldn't be a startup, but just the community itself, or a service organization that services the community.
mm,
to confine the scope of what you're building to that community, so that
mm,
you can then continuously turn the focus of your energy toward that community exclusively. Not to
mm,
then, not to say like other communities don't matter, but because the
mm,
only way that you can continue to increase the quality of your community is to
mm.
continuously put attention on it and the way it
Yeah,
works, right? And so if
yeah,
other
yeah.
communities do that too, very similar to
Mm,
how agent-based systems do that in general, or
mm,
how like individuals have to do it too, like in order for us to be stable contributors to society, we as individuals
mm,
also have to have some basic level
mm,
of self-sufficiency, that we
mm,
feel like we are going to be fine somewhat, right?
mm,
Like
mm,
if we don't have that, then we're not going to be stable contributors to
mm.
society. We might have spurts, we might have fits and starts,
Yeah,
but we won't be an actual pillar, quote unquote, of our community.
mm,
Um,
yeah,
because then other people will rely on us, if and if we can't simply
yeah.
just break away when the responsibility gets too tough. So
Mm,
that concept to me is very nicely encapsulated in this phrase that the metacurrency world has come up with, which is get mine and grow ours, right? Like it's
mm,
there's always
mm,
this trade-off between it, seemingly, but actually it's possible to 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 get to more grow hours, but first you have to get mine, and the grow
yeah.
hours actually does get mine, but at a higher
Mm,
scale.
mm. I love that. Get mine and grow ours. And I would actually like to push this a step further. And we're talking about it as we're building the philosophy of neighborhoods. Because what we're encouraging is for developers to come forward and start building those generic tools, right? Like build that generic chat tool and the generic Reddit tool or whatever. Um, but what's the reward in it for them, right? Like fine, they might create this one little widget that people can use. But what happens when people fork it? And you actually want to encourage forking, right? Like because the design should keep evolving. The current monetary system doesn't reward that, because if you lose control of it, you know that pie goes to someone else. And I think that's where reputation currencies play a role, because monetary currencies by principle are zero sum. Like if there's a pot of gold and I give you half, I'm left with half. But reputation currencies are not zero sum. So let's say we have a circle, of ideation, and we want to reward people for their ideation. There's no limit to how we can. It's not scarcity. I would say it's sufficiency. Like you can't award everyone a 5-star rating. Um, that's like the certificate for participation, but you can, you're not limited by the same rules of materiality. And so we've been trying to create this almost like this contribution graph, or I like to think of it more as a fabric, where based on how your tools are used, you receive monetary payback. But as your tools get forked, you receive reputational, payoffs within the ecosystem. And so it's kind of like, yes, if you've influenced the design of something, you receive status as a grandparent of sorts. So as your distance to what's being used increases, like there are more and more and more forks, your monetary payoff drops off, but your reputational reward rises. And that actually allows you to do a whole bunch of other, orchestration based on the memetic bridges that are built. But it allows us to start thinking in this way, because one of the things the commons, or, you know, contextual growth, like the way articulated it, has never had was a non-zero sum reward mechanism. And I think
Right.
the shift we have to make in our thinking is from scale to resonance. Like
Mm.
I built this little chat tool, and like it's so beautiful that it actually resonates and creates these hyper forks around the world, which is such a beautiful contrast to what I learned in business school, right? Like which was about plan and execute, and like an imperialist approach. But instead what you're saying is create something truly beautiful and watch it contextualize around the world. And I would like, I'm very vested, coming back to your first question of what am I doing and why am I doing it? I'd love to build, like, the aspiration is to build feedback loops which encourage that. And so my dream would be to see reputational currencies providing people with a sense of sufficiency in itself, right? It's almost like, I don't know. I mean, again, I don't want to sound too tech pro-ish, but someone like Elon Musk, I don't think his form of wealth today is just monetary capital, right? Like it's a reputational capital. Someone like him is now in that league where no matter what, where he goes, can always say, I'm starting a venture, and boom, like capital will kind of arrive at him. And I think this is a super, I think agent-centric technologies allow us to dump that down or democratize that down to the ground level, because if every person in India and China starts aspiring to live the American dream, it's game over for the planet. Like, we cannot sustain a billion people looking to buy their second and third houses. And so I think we need, at a macro level, a wealth system where someone can actually say, the monetary currencies that have been printed might be, I don't know, $50,000, but here's what I have in terms of potential, in terms of reputation. And so, again, at a more meta level, thinking of this more as like kinetic and potential energy, in physics, like you don't actually have to hold fuel. You can actually coil a spring and store it in a battery. And so I think that's the meta vision for sacred capital, like for reputation to play that role of sufficiency, where I can hold reputation in 50 different communities, and that's my sustenance,
Right.
because I know I can
Right.
monetize it based on my needs and based on
Right.
context.
Right.
So
that I guess this need for accumulation really does come from the sense that the world will not, like, I won't be able to have agency in the world forever, right? Like, in some sense, I mean, at least the way that we've created these pension schemes in the West, especially, it's like, work until 63, 67, whatever the number may be, 70, I think, in Greece now. And you do that so that you can then sort of sit back and just sort of be or wither away. But the funny thing is, actually, people who go into retirement, they generally die very quickly if they don't do anything, because there's nothing sustaining them on that, like, more ephemeral level, right? So, and I guess it's also an outgrowth of the industrial system. It was this idea, okay, we got to create one system, and then if everybody is in one system and we then all follow the rules, then we all benefit. And it's like, it's this machine for wealth, rather than understanding wealth as something that's organic, and that's something that you influence, and that's like in the interplay between things. And so I don't know, it's
I think 2020 is a great example in that sense, right? Like, the world has had to take a pause, and we just don't have the economic language for a pause. Like, what is that? Someone sent me a message yesterday. The US Treasury just last quarter had raised about $2.7 trillion. And according to the statements, $1.7 trillion is still with the Treasury. Like, it's not even dispersed. And I think I don't blame them. It's a challenge. Like, how do you, like, if you want to help the people, how do you even make those decisions? And we're back.
We are back, and it's still recording. Great.
Yeah.
Talk about decisions.
Yeah, I was talking about COVID and how I think there's a lot of governments out there speaking about the future of work. And I think future of work conversations are redundant without reputational infrastructure, because who is, I think with reputational infrastructure, you can start making decisions around microcredit, micro insurance, skill building, like all of these things only when reputational infrastructure is built. But the conversation with governments has been interesting. We've had a couple of conversations, and to me, it's really clear that this only gets built with agency, or or let me frame it this way, like reputation economics done badly is dystopian at worst and meaningless at best. And the feedback we're getting from some Asian governments is like they've used this top-down system to build reputation systems, and no one really cares. Like you get a library book without a deposit, and things like that. But when the government changes its lens to building infrastructure and then just facilitating micro apps, micro communities, micro entrepreneurs to articulate their own versions of reputation or their own cultural languages and orchestrate with each other, that's when like things start to happen. And so I think that's the lens with which governments need to think. And there's a few, I think, who are tuning into that. Some of them tend to be the more democratic ones because human agency is of primary importance to them. But I also think that those are tools that will start making sense for a lot of post-pandemic identity-related sense-making
Right.
and orchestration. So
Right.
yeah, that's
It's
how
kind
I
of
see it.
it's kind of funny how even expecting that an agent-centric system would be rolled out from the top down to have any kind of to actually work, like not rolled out, like it could work in the sense if there was this but you will virtually never find it in governments except for very few ones. I think Taiwan might be the only one that I can think of
Yeah,
that might do that, where
yeah.
it's they would see their own role as a service organization to
Mm,
the people on the ground doing
yeah,
their thing, right? Like that's how I see
yeah,
their
yeah,
digital democracy system as well.
yeah. Yeah, and that's kind of how I foresee it as well. Like there will be a handful of smaller nations, like 5 to 10s of millions kinds of population that hold democracy very sacred. And once that gains some kind of success, it nudges some of the larger nations to buy into it. Like again, like this parallel to India, right? Like India never really bought into freedom of entrepreneurship and open economies. It's only in the late 90s or the early 90s because of lack of options and because of, there were very strong cases for it in Japan and the Western world that India very reluctantly said, all right, we'll allow people to actually start up their own businesses. And, there was this very reluctant conversation to allow people to make money. I think in the same way, um, we'll move towards reputation economics in the same way. Like I think, but I think the onus is on us to therefore prove it working. And for me personally, after a couple of years of like ideating and speaking with people and building a community, it's heads down and building this out and giving it very tangible form, because I think conversations like these are great for people who are systems thinkers. Um, we have to make that very tangible case to, at the end of the day, the app builders and their end
Yes.
users, or I
Yes.
would say people who are building communities and
Yes.
their end users.
100%.
Um,
I think
yeah. So we've been. That's.
these conversations sustain us so that we feel like we can like jam sometime, and like and have some idea sex, but
That's true.
then I
Well,
really
I'm
agree
not
with
gonna
you.
lie. It also is a source of funding. Like these kinds of conversation. Oh, I would say there's a lot of systems thinkers who get it and are therefore
Yes.
willing to back ideas like this.
Yes.
But I think it's the role of the entrepreneur to translate it, and so that's why we're
Yes.
this language of neighborhoods. Like we're also bundling a lot of this into what I'm calling the reputation vault. So each user kind of
Right.
has their dashboard as they move from one network
Right.
to another,
Right.
and I mean, that's more marketing language that we're going to have
Right.
to develop. But I think that's the phase we're entering into now for the next six to
That's
nine
awesome.
months is
That's awesome.
just presenting those simple cases.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I feel like we've covered a lot of territory.
We
I'm very
have.
happy,
Yeah.
and I'm very happy that you at the end went back to like, let's try and make it concrete, because I, I do sense that there is an emerging group of people, or quality to certain people, where they don't, I mean, they love the out there and up there and like the system stuff, but then they know that's not enough to just think about it. They know that
Mm.
you have to make the bridge not only between communities, you also have to make the bridge
Mm.
between the abstract and the concrete, or between the
Mm.
beautiful vision and the
Mm.
actual energetic change. So
Mm. Yeah.
I want to, before we drop off, I'm going to quickly share my screen and basically try and capture what
Mm.
state sacred capital is in a visual
Mm-hmm.
way.
Mm.
So
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
okay, so
I'm interested to see where you're going.
great. So this is this weird tool that this genius that I'm working with has developed, and it's basically on the very basic level, it's just this strange graph thing.
Uh-huh.
But once you put a backend behind it and you build it into apps and those kind of things, it gets very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
We won't go too far into it right now, but I'll
Yeah.
briefly give you an understanding of what you're looking at here. So these
Mm.
are two instances of the same kind of thing. So we have down here, like the black means individual, right? It's you, the one who's doing the placing of these things. And then at the top is the collective, like everything else, like the world, whatever you can sort of put in that category. And so that's sort of a universal already graph in a sense, where it's like you and then everything else, and then you can decide what the everything else is. And then this color spectrum is like usually we're used to from red to green being like bad, medium, and good. And then this is here, but it's actually, that's still all the negative scale, or rather the energy expenditure scale. And then towards the left is the good scale, like is to like it's actually generating neg entropy. So left is entropy, right is neg entropy. And so what you're looking at with these kind of shapes here is that this shape, the circle, means your intent, your consciousness, your felt experience, like what's happening in your mind, basically, right? And so, for example, what's happening in our minds when we talk about these things, like, yes, we want to get everybody up there, and like we're caring about the world, and like let's make communities better, and so on. And then what's happening for us energetically, like for me personally energetically, with my body, with like how, in terms of how I'm feeling, how it's going for me, like whether it's generating energy or extracting energy, I feel like I am gaining a moderate amount of energy. You know, like there's more I could gain, like if I was like orgasming intellectually, and then there's like I could be completely bored and like actually actively disengaged and distracted, and like actually not want to connect with you again, right? And so that's sort of the basic idea. And so I'm gonna put here like, where do you feel sacred capital, according to your perspective, is at right now in terms of where your intentions are? Of course, those intentions I think are like this. Or are you actually focusing perhaps decidedly on a more proximal like goal, in a sense, to not have the distance between your intentions and your energetic like footprint be too large either? Because that's actually one of the interesting insights that I gain out of this way of visualizing it, is that when you put this here and when you put this here, like that's not a sustainable grouping. Like the distance is far too large, right?
Yeah. You're also very polarized.
Yes.
I feel like the last year has been about actively reducing that distance.
Interesting.
Because I think 2017 and 2018, like those big blockchain momentum years, you know, where everything was just off the charts, like I think pushed me really indigo. I think that was great because it allowed me to access a lot of potential or ideas in my head and like go really indigo. And the last, maybe even just the 6 months has been, breaking that down and bringing it more, I would say, bluish green.
Which
Maybe
one?
towards red.
So the
The square,
energetic.
this, and the square is where we
It's like the
and
energetic thing,
and I would say over the next 3 to 4 months, with the activation of holochain and stabilization of holochain, I think the sphere would move a little more towards the square. Like I want to move to a point where that polarization really drops off. Yeah, like something around those lines.
Interesting.
yeah, like
Great.
that's more, yeah, that's been a very active preparation on my part, like less high level conversations and more like, can we just build this library for now that actually can be integrated right away, like just getting into the nuts and bolts of things.
Right.
um yeah, yeah, I think that's a fair summary.
Did you see this meme about that we're not anymore in 2020, we're now in 2020B? Like it's like we already had 2020, we're now declaring it done, we're now moving on to 2020B.
Or let's say we just want to fork it and move into a new reality. But yeah, I would say 2020 has been idea generation, but more importantly, like shifting our language. Like if you spoke to me in 2019, I would be way more abstract.
Mm-hmm.
Like we hadn't even come up with the language for the reputation vault and these little reputation modules that we're building. Like it was a little more abstract. I think the last 6 months we've kind of dumbed it down and like broken it down into more tangible pieces as well.
Right.
And also like early stage like implementation to some extent. um, I think what we're just missing right now is a stable alpha of holochain, or a stable
Right.
anything of holochain. Like I think when we get that, we'll be able to move much more rapidly.
That's awesome. Well,
Mm.
thanks so much for joining me on the channel. And
Thank you for holding this.
I feel like there's a couple more conversations I want to have with some other people individually, but then ultimately I want to bring together a small sort of panel where some of these efforts intersect, where it's like sacred capital and maybe intake
Mm.
creativity and underscore protocol, and
Mm.
then maybe some
Mm.
people even outside of the holochain ecosystem. So
Yeah.
there's a whole lot of stuff happening, and I
Mm.
don't think it's a good idea to have them all like know everything about everything else. Like I think they should actually focus the energy on building their part, like, and being roughly aware of what other
Mm.
people are doing, so that we
Mm.
have that forward
Mm.
momentum. But
Mm.
I think there could be
Mm.
some value in having some conversations and at least building the relationships between the people, if not
Mm.
anything else.
Love to. Yeah.
Sweet.
Look forward to it. Yeah.
Well, thanks again,
Thank you.
and I'll talk to you soon.
Yes. Thank you.